didn't turn this away, so they should be on their way here at this point.
Time. I was hoping that would work.
Oh my goodness. Where?
I didn't see the article.
Yeah, a lot. Are you gonna hit?
No, I didn't get it.
That's
But this is what probably would have made it.
I'll give it to you.
And then everyone watching this into this place.
Yeah, but I mean, then you worry about like spectator, like the pointing at the.
I don't think that's the real. Yeah, but they would raise a protest.
Yeah. Hello.
Where are pups?
That's a great question.
Or the all.
Pups everywhere.
At this tournament, yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Wait, they're not back.
Where are the hops?
Wait.
I
No.
think they're up there.
Are they? Oh.
Are
Did
they?
they go out there? I feel like they both went out this way.
I
Yeah,
thought
and then
so
they came back in.
too.
Yeah.
Just chat.
No, 'cause I went around.
You went both ways?
I went around into the hallway and I didn't see them.
Oh, they went that way. That one? That one, like through the hallway that way.
Oh, okay. Give me a second.
Oh, well, maybe they went out the door.
They're coming.
They went that way.
Oh, there they are.
Wait, they're here. Yeah, they're here. It's a very confusing school.
No, he was like, do you want to meet up with me during prep for one of our other rounds? And I was like, yes, but I'm worried about leaving this building because I do not know if I'll be able to find my way back.
Are we all okay if I prop the door? Cool it down a little bit? Cool.
Yo, wait, no, don't get that anywhere near me, please.
I've been having so many experiences with spiders. One of them crawled on me during prep. No. And then our first round, there was like a spider jumping in the back. Oh yeah. Okay.
Alright. Let's get started. Well, congratulations to both teams to making it to elimination rounds at the TOC. It's very impressive and we look forward to a good debate. If everyone could speak at that desk, they wanted the recording, so that way everyone is able to see who's speaking. That would be great. If you don't want to be recorded, I'm sure you're able to talk to the NPDL people independently and then they just won't use the recording.
I have a stand. Everyone is welcome to use it. I don't know if you guys want to. I'll put it up in my own speech, but otherwise I don't have it in anyone's way.
Alright, well, we're ready to get started whenever you all are. And if you could introduce yourself before you each give your first speech, I think that would be great.
Hi, my name is Rithika. I'm going to be the first and third speaker for the affirmation.
Sorry, would you mind stating your last name?
Rithika Salva.
Thank you. I usually, like, I assume that the debaters time themselves. I also time just for.
Okay. I have an actual like ringer that'll go off. I don't know how to set it so it doesn't go off. Is everyone okay?
I
with
just do like the
I think it's,
stopwatch.
guys, I think
Just
it's fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I've had issues with stopwatches, so I like lost it.
Cool. So the order for this speech is going to be some top of case and then 3 advantages. Time starts in 3, 2, 1, now. We affirm the resolution that this House believes that developing countries should actively discourage the formation of primate cities. First, primate cities, as the info slide says, are disproportionately large. They seek to centralize resources and they encourage migration by definition to those primate cities. Some examples are like Seoul, Cairo, Bangkok, Lima, whatever. We think that our burden in this debate is not to prove the specific solvency of any one policy, because this is not focused on any one country. It's just in general, should governments seek to prevent primate cities from expanding and discourage the formation of primate cities. Cool. Any questions? Okay. The first contention is going to be that primate cities are bad for rural areas. The first layer of analysis is on economic imbalance and the uneven development of economies in these areas. Specifically, primate cities are focal points for a country's economic activity. They attract the most businesses, the most investment, and the most industry, which ends up leaving rural areas with almost nothing. For example, the World Bank found that in countries with primate cities, the amount of money that rural areas got were around 20% of the investment, higher than the amount of money that rural areas got. So specifically, we see that primate cities are attracting a disproportionate amount of investment that is much higher than rural areas.
Do you know why?
In Sao Paulo, for example, no thank you. In Sao Paulo, for example, there was 50% increase in investment there was 50% more investment into Sao Paulo than there were rural areas in Brazil. Specifically, we think that any amount of growth that happens in these primate cities comes at the cost of rural areas because there's resources being diverted from rural areas to these big cities. Specifically, the World Bank found that every 1% increase in the GDP of Sao Paulo correlated with a 0.7% GDP decrease in rural areas. So specifically, rural areas are being left behind. We think this leads to mass poverty in rural areas. But the second layer of analysis is that of brain drain. Specifically, we think that basically primate areas are attracting disproportionate amount of jobs and innovation, which forces people to essentially migrate to these cities. Specifically, we think this is really bad, and 30% of college-educated people in India moved to Delhi and Mumbai, and 43% of college-educated people in Brazil moved to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Specifically, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro attract 50 to 70% of Brazil's professionals, which is doctors and lawyers and engineers. And then the smaller rural parts of Brazil attract less than 1% of these skilled people. We have a couple of impacts of this. The first is healthcare workers fleeing. Specifically, we see that in South Africa, for example, the rural areas have one healthcare worker for every 5,000 people in the city. Meanwhile, Cape Town and Johannesburg have a very high concentration of healthcare workers. So we think there's a massive loss of healthcare workers. We think that we should actively discourage, we think, is equalizing resource distribution and policies like this to prevent brain drain from happening. Specifically, we would say that also urban growth is probably we say that primate cities are uniquely bad for this because in the world right now, the primate city growth rate in terms of their economy is 4%, the urban growth rate is 2.3%, and the rural growth rate is 0.7% between 2020 and 2025. So uniquely, primate cities are bad. And then the second impact to this is we think it creates basically an infinite cycle of inequality where any skilled workers that are going to contribute the economy are just fleeing to these primate areas. The third layer of analysis under this contention is that of political centralization. Sure.
You mentioned that doctors are moving to these primate cities to find hospitals and places to work. Assuming that these infrastructure don't exist in rural cities, how exactly would they even be able to use their skills in a world in which primate
so the infrastructure definitely does exist in rural areas. We see that there are many hospitals, they are very understaffed. The reason they are moving to these urban areas is because they are just bigger cities. There's the central of medical care, and they're going to be better for their career advancement. It's not that hospitals don't exist, because they definitely do. Okay, so on political centralization, specifically we think that political power ends up being concentrated in these primate cities, which leaves rural areas behind. 3 reasons for this. The first is that most of the national government structures are literally just in these areas, the government parliament building would be in those areas. Second, we would say that people who can vote and basically access mailing ballots and stuff like this will tend to live in primate cities, and they'll be able to participate in politics more. And then third, we would say that people from these primate cities are more easily able to run for office because they have access to a greater portion and base of people they can easily campaign to. Specifically, we think this is bad, first for infrastructure funding. For example, we see that Mexico City has 50% of the country's infrastructure public investment, but only 20% of the population, which means infrastructure in rural areas is getting degraded. And then second, we would find that South Africa has 60% of education funds going towards it, which leaves education in rural areas behind. Specifically, we think that this leads to the chronic underrepresentation of rural areas in politics, which means they will always be left behind. And it also justifies political leaders to justify the environmental degradation of these rural areas because they do not really care about them because the urban areas are the only ones represented in politics. And then fourth, on diversification, we think that specifically rural areas, because all these skilled workers and skilled industries are leaving them, they're forced to over-rely on natural resources, and that becomes the basis of their entire economy. Two impacts to this: first, massive environmental degradation in these rural areas, and then second, it also means that if there is like volatility and if there is a shortage of natural resources, they fall down very quickly. The second contention is it on being bad for the urban areas. The first argument under this is that of infrastructure. Specifically, we see massive overburdening of infrastructure in these areas that are at much over their capacity rate. Specifically, we see that this leads to infrastructure slows that are probably bad for the economy, because when infrastructure is overburdened, it works less and less, and you're able to use it like less and less to get to work and to get to important things, which is bad for the economy. But second, we think that in Sao Paulo specifically, infrastructure overburdening costs the government $3 million extra every single year to fix the infrastructure, which diverts government funding away from other important things. Second, on air pollution. We think specifically in these urban areas, there is a massive concentration of industry and of energy uses and of these people, and specifically that's really bad because it leads to a lot of air pollution. Air pollution kills 4 million people every single year, and specifically out of those deaths, 2 million people out of them were living in these primate cities. Specifically, the example of Mexico City, they have 700 parts per million of air pollution, and 10 parts per million is the WHO recommendation. For these two contentions, please vote affirm.
My name is Adrian Turkjev. I'm obviously going to be the first speaker for the opposition here. If anyone isn't ready, yeah.
Sorry, give us a second to get our sheets.
Yeah, take your time.
How many sheets?
I mean, I'm mostly just going to be going op case then gov case. So if that's two, then yeah.
How many is
We have 3 contentions. Okay, is everyone good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Side government basically envisions something like a Santa Claus government, one that can infinitely spend money and infinitely invest in infrastructure anywhere in the country. The simple reality here is that if you're a developing country, you're going to have to make sacrifices. You're not going to be able to get infrastructure everywhere. You're not going to be able to make everyone perfectly happy. So the question in this round isn't, is there a world where everyone's happy? The question in this round is, how can we best get out of being a developing country as soon as possible so that we can actually become a developed country that can actually fulfill this promise to all citizens, that can actually deliver infrastructure and whatnot to all citizens. To that extent, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose here. The first contention is going to be on the economic benefits of having such primate cities. There are 6 reasons here. So first thing here is going to be on efficiency. We're going to say that, like, look, all your resources are going to be in one place. Why is this really important? First of all, you need transportations for things like industrialization, which is to say, if I have the coal plant and then the thing that uses coal to produce something else, and then the market where things are being sold, if those are closer together, then there are smaller transportation costs to get them from one to the other. But the stronger version of this claim is that if you're a developing country, you don't have a lot of infrastructure and you can only make so much infrastructure. So let's make the infrastructure be where it's actually going to be used the most efficiently. But then the second thing under efficiency here is on actually having smart people in one place. They themselves give you the warrants here, and I think the implications are actually pretty obvious. If you have people in the country who can actually innovate, who can come up with new ideas, who can come up with smart policies, why would you spread them out across the country where they can't actually talk to one another efficiently, where they can't where they can't actually work together to solve these problems? We think it's much more efficient when you actually have all the people with the best ideas in one place. The third thing under efficiency here is that you actually have centralized financial services, which are a prerequisite for any kind of development, because hey, if you want to start a business, you need a loan from a bank. We think that when you have all those services centralized in one place, that not only helps private development, but it's also useful for the government, which I'm going to talk about Later, the fourth thing under efficiency, which is still the first sub-contention, is that these primate cities tend to develop in, say, port areas or other areas that are advantageous to international trade, and we think it's good if you actually centralize your resources there because you get more international trade. The second sub-contention here is on labor markets. Industrialization is a very important prerequisite to a developing country actually being able to be developed, right? We haven't seen any country that hasn't industrialized. To that end, you need a lot of workers you can actually employ in factories and whatnot to be able to industrialize, and we think that when you have a lot of people who are in one area, you actually have access to all of those workers, which not only means that you can pragmatically create these, but also means that people are more likely to create such ventures because they perceive themselves to have access to such human capital. We also tell you that specialization is really important, and when you have people who actually have specialized skills in one place, that again makes it more likely that you can actually find labor, the labor you need for this. The third thing here is on the infrastructure efficiency. This is really important and something side government misses. You have a very limited budget as a developing country, right? You're not raking in a lot of taxes. Your people don't have a lot of money. So there's only so much infrastructure you can make. And the claim we're going to make is simple. Make the infrastructure that the most people can actually use. If you build a really nice hospital and there's 3 people there to use it, it's a waste of a hospital, right? And so to that end, we're going to say that if we can build like a school or a hospital where it can help the most number of people, i.e. where people are most concentrated, that's always going to be good. The fourth thing here is on foreign direct investment. We think this is a prerequisite because if there's not a lot of capital in your country, you need someone else to give you the capital. Why do we get better foreign direct investment? First of all, when you're politically centralized, you're perceived to have better governance as opposed to rural areas, which are perceived to be corrupt. So more people actually come and invest. Second of all, you're more likely to have, no thank you a lot, to get through international recognition, which means that people are more likely to consider even investing there. And third of all, we think this leads to a virtuous cycle, i.e. more investors come, they spend more money, this gives the government more revenue, which they can use to, say, create even more infrastructure, which attracts even more investment. The fourth sub-contention here is on tourism. I think this is pretty intuitive. When you have one centralized area with good infrastructure, whereas the rest of the country has bad infrastructure, you're more likely to attract tourists. Whereas if you have a whole country where you have fine infrastructure, but it's kind of shoddy, you're not going to be able to compete with other tourist centers. In the last thing here is on consumers. I think this is pretty obvious. You need people to actually buy products from you as a firm for you to be able to develop. When you have a lot of consumers in one place, there are more people who can buy. You get more revenue as a company. The second contention here is on political benefits. The first sub-contention is on political accountability. When you have more people who are all in one place, they're more civically aware, they're better able to organize. You can co-opt all the warranting that Gov gives you here, which means that you have a more accountable government because people are, first of all, more aware of what's happening in the government because they're right there, but they're also better to take action. It's really easy for you as the government in one city where everyone there is part of the government to ignore what's happening in other cities. It's harder when you live next door to the people who are doing this. Why is this really important? Developing countries often fall prey to either authoritarianism or corruption. Both are bad. If you're corrupt, you can't invest in infrastructure. You're less likely to get foreign investment. If you're authoritarian, that's bad. The second thing here is efficiency in implementing government policies when you're closer to, for instance, private interest, NGOs, international organizations like, say, UN headquarters. You're better able to actually work with them to implement certain policies. So, for instance, if you want to work with the private sector, you're better able to do that when it's actually concentrated. Why is this really important? The government being able to actually efficiently implement their policies is a prerequisite to developing as a country because you need the government to be able to actually implement policies. No, thank you. That will actually lead to that. The third thing here is on cultural soft power. Think about how, for instance, Seoul becomes a cultural center because you have a lot of people who may be artistically minded working together. Why is this really important? It means that your culture is more likely to, say, spread throughout the world. Think about something. Yeah.
Wait, why is it that there's going to be more efficient implementation of policies?
The warrants for efficient implementation of policy is that you're close to other actors that the government often has to work with, like NGOs, like the private sector, like international headquarters of organizations like the UN. And since you're closer to them, you're more likely to be able to work with them. I'm going to unpause my time. I have about 2 minutes and 30 seconds on my clock. As I was saying, when you have a lot of, when you have the culture very centralized, you're more likely to develop a strong culture, and it's more likely to actually promulgate itself in the world because you have, let's say, more concentrated media in this area. Why is this really important? It gives you soft power as a country internationally, which means that you actually have a better chance of developing good relations, good trade relations, etc. with other countries. The third contention here is on problems of implementation. They say we don't have to give you a way, we're actually going to do this. But what we say is that if every possible way you could implement this is going to be bad, it's probably not a good idea. So we tell you that there's, generally speaking, 2 ways the government can try and prevent the formation of these cities. First of all, they can try and spread their money throughout the country so there's no economic incentive to go to one centralized area. But we tell you that centralization is going to happen anyways. If Amazon comes and builds a factory in one city, now everyone's going to come there, and then you're going to get the virtuous cycle we talked talk about, which means you're just wasted your money by putting it all in other areas. And we also tell you that when you have a limited budget, when you spread your money everywhere, it's like you're not going to have some good hospitals, you're just going to have bad hospitals everywhere. No thank you. We also tell you that, second of all, any alternative, more authoritarian measure of, say, population control, i.e. stopping people from migrating, is going to be even more dangerous. It's very easy to backslide into authoritarian governments. And also it means that, for instance, you can look to like the hukou system in China. It means that you have a lot of people illegally migrating, which creates other headaches for the government. Getting quickly to GovCase, first of all, they talk about rural centers. They say that, hey, look, rural areas don't get a lot of funding. How do rural areas develop? When we give them infrastructure, when we actually invest in letting them build their own infrastructure. To have that infrastructure, you need money, and they don't tell you where the government's going to be getting this money from. We tell you it comes from these cities. And when they give you these statistics, that's like primate cities grow by 4% and rural areas grow by 0.7%. Yeah, exactly. So let's build the areas that develop quicker. Why would you try and keep the whole country at the 0.7 development rate when we can try and put as much of it as possible into the 4% development rate? They talk about how, political centralization exists. We tell you that, first of all, this is a really good thing. We tell you that having any possible representation in, say, rural areas, the prerequisite to that is having a representative government in the first place. We think that we actually ensure that by making sure that you have more political accountability on our side. And for all these reasons, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose in this round.
Hello judges, my name is Elia Wee. I'll be giving the second affirmation speech. The order is going to be going over my opponent's case and then extending our case.
Is that in order?
Yeah, in order of the way it was read. Okay. Everyone ready? Okay. My time will start in 3, 2, 1, now. My opponents lose this round when they admit that when you make a lot of short-term development, that comes at the cost of long-term development. And what I'm going to be proving to you throughout the speech is why long-term development is always going to be over short-term development. They paint this picture like a Santa Claus government and how a developing country needs to make sacrifices. But what we tell you is that these are not sacrifices. These are making the situation even worse. The GDP is not just growing at a slower rate. The GDP is going down. This means that people are actively suffering more than they would have if these what are they called? Primate cities were not there in the first place. My opponents tell you this is going to make it so that these countries quickly develop, but we tell you that when you have quick development at the cost of the majority of your population, these countries are ultimately going to fail. They cannot sustain their developed status because all of these infrastructure, all this stuff is going to fail. That's what we're going to get to in the responses. The first thing that they come at with you is that you can only make so much infrastructure. They tell you want to put it where you can use it the most. But we tell you that if all development for an entire country relies on 2 ramps, when these 2 ramps are obviously going to break, they're going to degrade. You can look at the conceded warrant from my partner's first speech that tells you the Sao Paulo government had to spend $3 million extra repairing infrastructure. This is $3 million coming out of what could have been used to improve education, improve health. This is really bad. We tell you that also it's useless if you make infrastructure if it just breaks within 6 months. This is uniquely really bad. My opponents tell you how you should have all the smart people in one place, you can't spread them out. But we tell you that means you cannot save the 80% of the population. If you look at Mexico City, only 20% of the population actually lives in the city. Only 20% has access to healthcare. This is coming at the cost of the majority of the population. 80% of the population is not getting affordable healthcare, is not getting what they need to survive. This is really important. We also tell you that even if they aren't spread out, this is kind of not really making sense because people have the internet. They can talk to each other. You don't need to be in the same building in order to have productive academic conversations. And on centralizing resources, we're actually going to turn this because if we force rural areas to only focus on raw materials, then the raw materials end up being further away from rural areas. So if every region had a mix of industry, then the economy would improve. Otherwise, you just have to transport things a really long distance. So the transportation thing is actually a net bad for their son. My opponents tell you about like how centralized finances help the development of companies, but we're telling you that companies are only going to these primate cities because all the infrastructure and all the funding is going to these primate cities. It is not that the companies are there so the finance is there. It is because all the development there that these companies are forced to go there. These companies can survive on their own even without these centralized finances. We also tell you, my opponents tell you about like how industrialization is like a prereq and like how you want to have a lot of workers. But our response here is that these workers are going to not be able to work very well if they're dying because they're living in a place where like the parts per million of air pollution are like 70 times higher than what it's supposed to actually be. These workers are going to die because they're living in slums like between like 5 different factories that are all emitting bad air pollution. They're not going to have like a good quality of life. Even like they're just going to become cogs in a machine where they're just working for something that is not even going to benefit them. My opponents talk about this like limited budget, how you should make like infrastructure that many people can use. But again, the people are only concentrated there because all the infrastructure is there. It is not that the people are there and the infrastructure is responding to it. All of these things are why you need it there is just because this is the problem that the government made with their own like distribution of like resources and their allocation of resources. And also, in fact, companies are incentivized to move away from each other, and the only reason why they stay centralized is because of the government. If they're like all in close proximity, like that's really bad because now you're competing with a bunch of different people. If you have like a bunch of like the same like stop, no thank you, shop on the same street, like that's obviously worse for your shop. Okay, we also tell you, my opponents talk about like how centralized means that like you have like less rural corruption, but the reason why a lot of places have rural corruption is because there's no oversight because all the attention is focused on these primate cities. We tell you that all of these issues are caused by the concentration of resources into one place and because people are just like willing to throw away the lives of 80% of the population. We also tell you that on their point on tourism, the first thing here is you can't attract tourists if your air pollution is 70 times what it's actually supposed to be. No one wants to go there. People are going to just like get health harms. Sure.
Why do people go to Seoul then?
Okay, well Seoul doesn't have like that wasn't like the specific warrant that we read. But also that's because like there's like it's also it's not really facing the problems that because it has like recently developed into what it is right now. I would also tell you that like attracting tourists leads to just even more overcrowding because everything is just going to be going there. It's not just like all the development focused on 2 ramps. It's all the development plus like 30,000 tourists all going on those 2 ramps. Obviously, this is going to lead to like $3 million extra costs. On their second connection on political organization, they tell you about like how civic closeness means like accountability, but we tell you that no one is going to account like or disagree with the policies being passed if all the politicians are coming from the same place because no one else can garner support in the same way that people in these primate cities can. There's not going to be any dissent. There's not going to be anything. We also tell you that tourism is uniquely bad because it destroys culture and kills the environment. You don't want this to like be the only thing that your economy is focused on. That's actually a problem that Seoul is facing right now, like only tourism and nothing else. Okay, we would also tell you that like my opponents talk about like effective implementation of policies. We have 2 responses here. The first response here is that physical closeness like doesn't really have an impact here, and then this because you're just like rolling out a policy. And then the second response here is that you don't want a bunch of like people to be following bad policies because there's no dissent, there's no competition, there's no people supporting diverse views. We also see that we're going to turn civic engagement because if politics is being used to systematically exclude 80% of the population, this is clearly not good politics. We would also tell you, that like on cultural power leads to like good relations and leads to like good trade. We'd tell you that no one likes an unstable government, and when you have an unstable government, people are always walking on eggshells around you. People are not going to actively include them in trade. This is uniquely bad. And then my opponents give you like a bunch of no-saws on like the methods in which these development like nations would do that. They tell you like spreading the money is bad, but we tell you again like putting the money all in one place is wasting it because you like 1 it breaks immediately and 2 you have to put even more money into it. But we also tell you that like we don't really have to defend a specific mechanism because we're just talking about this in general. Okay, now to extend my case, our case is like pretty much dropped. My opponent's only response here is that you have to make a sacrifice, the 1% versus the 0.7%. But again, we tell you that this is not a sacrifice if it's making the situation worse. This is like really clear, like this is very clear. It's not just like one part has slower growth. It's that 80% of the population is being directly harmed just so that 20% of the population can experience a marginal like increase. This is really bad. We would also tell you that like brain drain is a really bad problem because it's ultimately unsustainable. Like the biggest argument here is that it's very unsustainable to quickly develop while excluding 80% of the population. This is going to lead to a lot of anger. This is going to lead to instability. This is going to lead to like all of your investments into things that are going to break quickly. You have to just pay more money. We're also going to extend the flight of rural doctors leaving hospital empties. That literally kills people. Urban hospitals are already staffed enough, and this is not like And this is clearly a really big problem. Like, these rural doctors are leaving in response to the policies. They're not just leaving, and then the policies aren't responding to them at all. We would also tell you that even in these primate cities, people are not very happy. We tell you that 35+% of the urban population in developing countries live in slums. This is really bad because these people are not even being helped. There's massive inequality even within these primate cities and with these primate cities and like the rest of the 80% of the population. We would also tell you that inequality is going to lead to ultimate like stagflation, and that's going to be really bad for the long-term effects on the economy. This is really not bad. So because we value the long term, because we value people dying and people being, and the majority of the people being actively harmed, because we want to protect the environment from like dumping waste into rivers, polluting, which kills 4 million people a year, vote AF. Thank you.
Oh my god, so much sheets.
Yes.
Sorry, just 1 sec.
Okay, I will try my very best to stay on the flow. That was quite a speech. So we try our best. But overall layout, we're going to be going op case, or actually we'll start on the gov case, then we'll go op case after some topic case. So
Sorry, wait,
Okay.
just give us a second.
Some
to
pretty
organize
normal
the
stuff.
sheets.
yeah, no problem.
I think this is my flow, no? Wait, there's
Oh wait, yes, please.
I don't know what that is. That's what I hear more. Wait, can I have more legal paper?
We also have like hella paper here if you guys want some.
Thank you.
Thanks. What do you want more? Okay, one more sheet of milk. Okay, we're ready. Sorry.
Okay. If everyone's ready, start my time.
Wait, can we
in-
get the order?
Yeah, so, my name's Josh Pompiliski, second op speaker. Few things. First, I'll be going top of case, overall broad view of this round. Then I'll go gov case, op case. That should be everything. There's a lot of cross application here, so I'll try to just make it explicit when I'm connecting. But just be ready for that. Okay. If everyone's ready, start my time in 3, 2, 1. At the beginning of his speech, Adrian comes up here and tells you a very simple phrase. This is a developing nation. Many of the mechanisms that developed countries have available to them, such that they can develop the things that they want to, are only available to developed countries. And they come up here and agree, but then go on to contradict that very principle that they put forth. A few implications that has on this round. 1. The number one goal of any given developing country is in fact that, to develop. Whether or not pollution is going to be a problem for them 200 years in the future is not going to be their number one priority. Moreover, whether or not some random rural areas are going to that have very few people in them, and this is really important, are likely not going to be their priority. Why? Insofar as they can benefit far more people, as well as benefit their actual economy by prioritizing their urban centers, they are going to prioritize those urban centers every time, both on util and with regards to what builds them up as a country. Still protected time. Okay, with that said, let's now get into a few more specifics here. Going down the gov case. On their first contention, they tell you that these primate cities are actually bad for rural areas. And their first sub-contention here is economic harm, active loss of GDP for rural areas when you develop these primate cities. First of all, on this idea of an active loss of GDP, we tell you a few things. One, they don't give you a warrant as to how this actively harms rural centers. When you have development of specific primate cities, I don't see any reason as to why other areas would actively be harmed. Perhaps they wouldn't be benefited in the same ways that primate cities would, but we don't see any active harm there, or at least no plausible active harm. But beyond this, we tell you that the more likely place they got the statistic from is that they are not going to have a proportional increase in GDP to the same extent that your primate cities are going to. But now let's look at some actual warrants as to why this is probably not going to happen. First, we tell you that there is likely no money at all going to rural areas prior to the development of the primate cities, and this prerequisite is going to be really, really important. for a developing nation to become developed, or even for like a non-existent nation to become developing in the first place, you need to have some hub of activity, whether it be an economic hub of activity, a tourism hub of activity, any of the above. You need to have that developed in the first place before any money is going to go into rural areas at all. Insofar as having some form of a city, insofar as having some form of a major city developing is going to bring at least some level of output to rural areas, we think you're benefiting on that side. Second response here is like, or I apologize, really that was so.
POC, sorry.
Yes.
Is the argument that like the resources from urban areas get distributed to the rural areas?
So we think that for rural areas to be effective or have any economic activity, you need to have some population hub, whether that be because these rural areas are like growing the food that goes to those population hubs, or providing them with something. So we think that just on like simple warranting, we can win on that case. Okay, second response is like investment is actually bad for people there if it does happen, which it won't. And this is a really like new response here, which is the idea that if Amazon is going to be conducting some business in some really like rural part of some country in Africa, we think that that business is going to be bad for the people there. So we would prefer to have investment in centralized hubs such as like Jakarta for Indonesia than we would to have like rural Indonesia entirely. Why? What is Amazon going to do if you give them property in rural Indonesia? We're probably going to see like workers' rights abuses. We're going to see mass economic exploitation of those areas. So we think that any investment that goes into completely rural areas that nobody's ever seen or heard of and has no political accountability is a net harm. So if anything, turn their sub-contention A on their C1. Now let's go to the idea of brain drain, for which I have 4 responses. 1, we don't think that this is like actually quantifies as brain drain insofar as they are remaining within your country and going to citizens of your own country. Second, like they are moving there not because they want to, or it's not that they don't want to, but they're not moving there because of a lack of ability to stay in rural areas. They're moving there because it has the necessary infrastructure and the necessary people. First, I point you to like the actual physical infrastructure, being that if you are a doctor, you need a hospital to work in. Moreover, if you are a lawyer or a work in finance, you need some type of structure to work within, and you can't do that in a world in which you're just working in like some rural part of a country. So likely this brain drain happens because you need that infrastructure. Why can't you get that infrastructure on their side? Because it's not Santa Claus. Indonesia can't build a hospital in every single rural part of Indonesia. No, we'd rather them have a few hospitals in Jakarta than no hospitals anywhere. Because hospitals are reliant on 2 things. A, the money to build a hospital itself. We think Indonesia has limited resources and they should direct those resources to centers with the most people. Second reason is because you need people. A hospital can't run with 1 doctor. A hospital needs at least like a pretty substantive medical staff. So we think that to actually get those people together, which is a prerequisite for having any hospital, you need to have these primate cities to begin with. Third response here is that I apologize. Fourth response here is that they are moving to where there is more people. So as far as like util or net benefits, you're going to have more workers where there's more people. We win in either world. Okay, now let's go into their idea of like political power centralization. I believe this is their second contention. You can cross-apply a lot of our second contention that gets unresponded to here, which is like when you have people literally staring down the government because they live in these primate cities where the government is also operating, you have significantly more accountability. Second response here is just like on government efficiency. We think that one of the primary issues like plaguing developing nations is that they have like inefficient governments. They have governments that take a long time to legislatively get anything done. We account for that. That one cleanly dropped. They then tell you that like 80% of people will not be represented because they live in rural areas. I think that's vastly untrue, and we actually think you get more representation on our side for 2 reasons. 1, I point you to like our very own country. Like Washington D.C. is capable of representing rural Kansas despite the fact that it's not in rural Kansas. We don't think that's an actual prerequisite. You have the ability to represent people living in other areas. That's like the very basis of representative democracy. Second idea though here is we actually represent rural Kansas better in our world. Why? Because if you have a decentralized government, there is no accountability for that government. So we uniquely give you the ability for people to actually be viewing the action that is being taken regarding Kansas in our side that you don't get on their side with like a decentralized, incapable government, and you get efficient legislation on our side. We think you get a better government for both the primate city and the rural areas on our side. Third response here is that you can get a diversity of thought in a world where you actually have a government of one place. They tell you that you're not going to get any diversity of thought. We tell you we get more diversity of thought because you have a cultural hub where there are actual ideas developing from this diversity. Fourth response, and this is what I really want you to flow and put down bolded, economic stability is a prerequisite to actual political stability. You cannot have a politically stable government if that government does not have the economic backing to be successful. There is nothing that can respond to this. This point is highlighted, bolded in your flow. Now let's move on to the op case. Okay, First thing they tell you is on our infrastructure contention regarding efficiency, they say this infrastructure is going to be overwhelmed. That is our very best hope. We hope it's overwhelmed. Why? Because when infrastructure gets overwhelmed, it means it's being used. In their world, if they can make the claim that their infrastructure will not be overwhelmed because it's so decentralized, we tell you one of two things is true. A, the infrastructure is not being used and therefore you have critical and scarce money going to waste. Or B, they're claiming that they have all the resources to support this infinite infrastructure, which they don't. And insofar as their cases rely on like infinite resources for an actively developing nation, you should not be voting for them. Second response here is on pollution, and this is a really important point in their case that I want to respond to now. I have 3 responses. One, you get air pollution efficiency from centralization. When you have more infrastructure and development in one place, you become more efficient at using the resources that you have. Less transportation, less like broad going back and forth. So we actually think we limit air pollution on our side. Second response, and this is the really important one, any pollution that you get from our side comes from an increase in productivity and an increase in production. If you are to have equal production on both sides, you are going to have the same amount of factories. You are going to have the same amount of workers. You're going to have the same amount of things getting done. So any harms they give you stemming from economic pollution applying to our side come from the fact that our side gives you more factories, more cultural hubs. On the other hand, of course, they get less pollution because they're going to have a bunch of villages that aren't actually getting anything done. So they either have to concede that they get nothing done, or they have to concede that this pollution is only happening because it's getting stuff done. So we think that you're voting for us on that every single time. Finally, on tourism, they tell you it destroys culture. We tell you that tourism actually bolsters culture and gives it a national stage on which to operate. And this is really good because we want people coming to our cultural centers. Look at New York City. People come to New York City and subtract that culture and bring it to their own countries. This is all good. And with that, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Phenomenal. If anyone isn't ready or needs a second, let me know. If not, I'll start my time on my first word.
Just need to make sure this is all I can do. Okay, cool. We're good.
Yeah. So I think Josh gives you a pretty compelling speech, but what I'm going to do here is assume that you literally didn't listen to his entire speech and don't buy anything he told you, and show you why. Based on dropped arguments and weighing alone, this is a pretty clear ballot for us. The first thing I want to ask you is, does side government ever convince you that this is actually an idea we can implement effectively? I think this is very important. So our third contention here says, hey, look guys, there's no way we can actually do this. Either we're just going to waste our money throwing it all around the country, we're going to end up getting centralization everywhere and then the money's going to be everywhere, or we're going to have some sort of authoritarian power controls which haven't exactly done wonders for China, right? And I think they really mishandle this because they say we don't have to prove how we're going to do this. And sure, you don't, but if there's no good way to do your idea, then I'd say it's a pretty bad idea. If my idea was, hey, I'm going to like build the Empire State Building in this room, like obviously that's not going to happen, so maybe in theory it's great, but if you can't actually do it, I don't think you can vote in it. I want to talk about a couple things that we're probably going to get out of PMR and why you're not voting on them. So first of all, in terms of rural areas, I want to say a couple things. First of all, we tell you that, like, sure, yes, rural areas won't get a lot of investment in our world at that first. But they're not going to get investment in their side either because you have no money with which to invest in these areas. But then second of all, we tell you that we prerequisite this because over and over again, we give you the mechanism for lifting rural areas out of poverty. You invest in them, you build infrastructure there, right? But what Josh tells you here is that, like, hey, look, if we can't build this infrastructure in the first place, we won't be able to solve for this. But also, if, like, people can't use this, then it's not going to be useful. But then in terms of this quality of life in cities point, first of all, I want to tell you that all the impacts they give you here on like overcrowding and pollution, whatever, are non-unique because insofar as your alternative on their side is just that you're stuck in some like poor rural area.
Stop time.
Yeah.
The argument that pollution and infrastructure issues are non-unique is new.
Well, two things. First of all, no, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I provided two different scenarios. Like either you accept the burden that this pollution is going to be everywhere because you have to equally build factories everywhere, or it's going to be in rural or urban areas and therefore have an increase in net.
I'm also going to say that first of all, I'm not introducing any new claims since you guys, I think both sides actually gave the claims that like it sucks to be in a poor rural area. And so all I'm doing is I'm doing weighing. I'm saying like you ought not prioritize this impact of pollution because it's an impact that's going to happen either way. And I think the claim that the comparative is being in a pro-rural area is something that exists either way, but it's ultimately judge discretion. I have about 2:20 on my clock. I'm gonna get started now. But then even if you don't buy that non-unique claim, we tell you that, like, second of all, efficient resource use actually solves for this problem, which is to say that their best case scenario is, hey, instead we have air pollution in a bunch of different places in our country, which is ostensibly worse. And we also tell you that, like, the only way they can... Yeah, what's up?
Sorry, the argument that it's actively worse if the pollution is in rural areas as opposed to urban areas is new.
I think this claim is coming pretty cleanly out of Josh's speech, where he says that, like, when you efficiently use resources, you limit the pollution because everything's happening in one place, as opposed to if you have everything spread out, you get more pollution because you have more infrastructure.
Go back and forth with PROs. This is gonna be judge's discretion.
Yep, I'm gonna keep going. And then we also tell you that the only way they avoid this impact is by not developing the country. That being said, I want to first of all talk about this claim of political stability. I think they really mishandle our claim here. Our claim here is that, hey, look, when you live where the government is, you can directly see what the government's doing, and the government can directly see you. You can directly organize because everyone's centralized. They themselves give you the claims on why you get easier organization, right? And Josh tells you that you can still have a diversity of thought in a city. Just because everyone lives in one area doesn't mean they're going to think the same thing. Josh gives you these warrants, but then crucially they drop my warrants on why you have a larger media presence in these government hubs, which means that you actually get more awareness of what's going on, right? On the other hand, the only claims we get from there is, hey, you're going to have a uniformity of thought, which we respond to, and then they say you can't represent rural areas, but we tell you that first of all, having an accountable government is a prerequisite to doing that. That's in my LOC, and then we also tell you that, like, hey, you actually can still represent rural areas. It's called representative democracy, right? So what's the weighing here? We think that if their side is resulting in some sort of authoritarian backsliding, we actually have no checks on the power of the government. Obviously, the magnitude there is going to be pretty bad because, like, hey, people are actively going to be facing things like oppression. But then the second place you're voting for us is on economic development. What's the problem in the status quo? You're poor, you're a developing country, so how do we solve this? Ultimately, it all comes from capital. You need capital to be able to build up companies, to be able to generate more wealth. And they give you no source of capital. No place where these companies are actually going to get the money they need to create the companies and grow the companies. We give you 3 sources of capital that are never responded to. First of all, foreign direct investment. This is never touched in this round. Second of all, you have more consumers, which are concentrated, which means you have more money for businesses, never responded to. And then tourism, which is at best mishandled by them. This is a prerequisite for everything else. First of all, it's a prerequisite for political stability, as Josh tells you. Second of all, it's a prerequisite for the infrastructure you need to help rural areas. If you have no money as a government because you have no companies, you can't build infrastructure, you can't pull money off of trees. And finally, on magnitude, we tell you there's always more people in cities, more people who are benefiting from this. At the end of the day, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose here.
That's what I get for being here.
Sorry, let me just get the papers in the order. Sorry, one sec. This is blank. Okay. The order is going to be starting at the top on some weighing. Our case in the order of benefits to urban areas, then benefits to rural areas, and then their case. Let me just tie my shoes. Okay. Time starts in 3, 2, 1, now. We can see that the economy is a prerequisite to like politics, so just wipe their politics offense off of your flow. But we would also tell you, even if you somehow buy that politics is important, we have a clean drop turn from the MG that says politics is actively bad if it's being used to systematically exclude 80% of the population, and if it's being used in a way that now political leaders only care about people in urban areas and can therefore take away vital resources from rural areas. That's probably a turn. Cool, let's go on our case. The biggest point you can probably pretty cleanly vote on is that of air pollution. The biggest argument we give you here is that air pollution is uniquely high in these concentrated cities because industries concentrated them, because people emitting are concentrated there. They tell you it's probably worse if we have less concentrated air pollution in more spaces. This is just not how air pollution works. If you have 400 ppm, that is bad. If you have 50 ppm everywhere, that is not bad. There is a certain bright line where if air pollution goes over it, that ends up causing health harms. Okay, then they also say that no, because cities are more efficient, therefore there's less air pollution. We're gonna golden turn this. We say that if you increase the complexity of systems in cities, then that means you decrease efficiency, specifically because we have things like cars and trains idling because of all the overcrowding we have. That means more pollution. Okay, so specifically you can just sign your ballot on air pollution, but let's weigh this a little bit. What we tell you, extended from the PMC, is that air pollution kills 4 million people every single year, and out of those 4 million people, 2 million of the people that prematurely die due to air pollution live in these primate cities. And that is disproportionately higher than what percentage of the population lives in primate cities, which again is less than 20%. So disproportionately, primate cities have more air pollution
Point of
because
order.
it's more
I think the claim about this being disproportionate is new.
I mean, like, if you don't want to buy disproportionate, all I'm doing is putting together the less than 20% and the 2 million.
But I think like the PPMs are.
Sorry, no back and forth for POS.
And then the ppm is like in our case, but yeah. Cool. Even if you buy that POO, you're still just buying that there's more concentrated pollution in urban areas, which is bad. We'll weigh this in 3 ways. One, on magnitude. We think death outweighs everything else because it has infinite magnitude. If you are dead, you cannot experience pleasure. You can't like have anything happen to you. You cannot contribute to the economy. We tell you death probably outweighs. And then specifically, we would say that second, death is a prerequisite to the economy, and probably pollution is a prerequisite to the economy, because if 35% of people are living in slums where they have to take days off from their work because they have health conditions and are literally dying, they probably can't contribute to the economy. But then third, we'll tell you we probably outweigh on like probability, because like we see these people already dying in the status quo. Meanwhile, they do not have any comparable example of when a mega city has been very good for the economy. They just don't give that to you. But the second way you can probably pretty cleanly sign your ballot for the affirmative is on this issue of essentially like rural areas being left behind. The pretty cleanly conceded argument that we give you here is that essentially there's massive capital flight and flight of investment away from rural areas. We tell you, one, you're always going to be prioritizing these rural areas at the point where like they can't prove any benefit to rural areas, but we tell you that mega cities are only 20% of the population, so you probably prioritize the bigger rural areas. That probably outweighs on scope. So we tell you that they are actively bad for rural areas at the point where doctors at increasing rates are like going away from rural areas. These are the hospitals that are understaffed to urban areas, and this is dropped out of the MG. These urban areas don't need more doctors. They have already enough doctors to serve their population. They have 2 lastest responses to this. The first is that they're not there because there's no hospitals, no people to serve. Again, dropped out of the PMC is the argument that there are vacant hospitals in rural areas. They have the infrastructure, they don't have the doctors. We tell you this probably impacts out to people in rural areas dying because they don't have healthcare. That probably outweighs on magnitude. Then they tell you that we don't prove to you why rural areas actively lose their GDP and actively lose their economy. If you want a very clean stat to vote on, extend from the PMC the argument we give you that in Sao Paulo, every 1% increase in GDP of these mega cities is correlated with a 0.7% decrease in GDP in rural areas. So we prove that there is an active decline for 80% of the population, and we give you the warranting to do this work. Okay. They also say that we need a hub of activity to be good for the economy. We tell you no, because we have this drop turn from the MG that tells you that this is actually worse of a hub for the economy, because what you're doing is you're forcing rural areas to essentially be the ones that entirely make their economy based upon extracting resources. That means that urban areas are really far away from where the resources actually are, and you have this split between resources and industry that actually turns their entire case, because it means that urban areas are really far away from the resources they need to manufacture things. Extend the turns that we tell you that tourism is bad, you probably just can't vote on tourism. And then on FDI, we would tell you that like at the point, and then we would tell you long-term development comes first, that's conceded out of the MG. For all these reasons, please vote affirmative.
Great run, guys.
Yeah.
Tim, we'll be right back. See where you made power.